Jefferson's Revolution of 1800, Fact or Fiction, will be the topic of today's lecture. We're going to look at Jefferson's time in office, his successes, his failures, what he did well, what he did not do very well, and of course consider him in relation to those who preceded him in the office of president. Jefferson claimed that his election was revolutionary. There had been a peaceful change of the political parties. 4 years of John Adams, previous to that, 8 years of Washington. The Federalists had been the majority party. Now in 1800, the election we know was a little bit crazy in how it turned out between Jefferson and Burr. But now Jefferson fully expected to implement some drastic changes. The way he thought the government should be involved in people's lives, and it was going to be, he thought and expected it to be, a stark contrast with those who came before him in office, especially his immediate predecessor, and that would be John Adams. So let's look at this. Let's consider whether or not we can accurately call this the so-called Revolution of 1800. It is Jefferson who, when he gets elected, promises, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. He says that in his inaugural address. Jefferson, again, not very much of an outgoing personality as far as someone compared to Patrick Henry. Not going to thump his chest and cry, "Give me liberty" or "Give me death." He'd always been the quiet person who sat in the back row during the different debates of the Continental Congress. But he's going to operate behind the scenes. He's the first president to be inaugurated in the new national city, or the federal city as they called it, Washington, D.C. It was still unfinished at the time, and Jefferson thought that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. So let's look at, again, the still uncompleted, when he comes into office, President's Mansion, as they sometimes call it. It wasn't officially designated the White House just yet. Jefferson, for the most part, he's a widower. His wife had passed away several years before, and so he lives in this house with essentially his secretary. And it's a stark contrast to what he thought was a lot of the pomp and circumstance that followed Washington and Adams. You can expect to see him on horseback in the morning, going around the city itself. The city was very much uncompleted. The Capitol had not been finished. There were few permanent residences. There were more taverns than churches, kind of develops in the same model as most colonial cities. But he thought it was great that he was able to move the city away, the new federal capital, away from the established cities, such as New York and Philadelphia. He thinks that's a good thing. What does he do in office, and is it, at the end of the day, revolutionary? Well, he repealed all internal taxes, which was going to make him very popular with anyone in the country. He also let the Alien and Sedition Acts expire. He would later say there will be no witch hunts in my presidency. In other words, he doesn't see any need to prosecute anyone, newspaper editors or Federalists, because essentially when he comes into office, a gift that is left to him from John Adams is that he is, and the United States specifically, does not have an impending conflict with either France or Great Britain. With that in mind, he decides he's going to slash the armed forces of the United States, cuts the army down to 3,500. He does support the creation of the military academy for the army. That's at West Point. It's the old fort that Benedict Arnold had tried to turn over to the British in 1780 and 1781. He also supports that the Army should be smaller, it should be smarter, and therefore we see the creation of the Army Corps of Engineers. He takes the Navy that had been built in the build-up to the war with France, and it essentially takes it out of the water. It's called mothballing the fleet. He'll use it, and it's a good thing the United States has something of a small Navy in the early 1800s. But he thinks we can send the officers home, we can cut the number of individuals who are in the army. There's no need to have an army. We're not going to fight anybody. And so it's Jefferson who says we're going to rely on two main sources of revenue for the United States. That's the tax on imports. His Secretary of the Treasury goes to Jefferson and says, you know what, I hate to admit it, Mr. President, but Hamilton's financial plan has been working pretty well. But Jefferson thinks, okay, we're not going to really dismantle it. So the sale of land in the West, and land is selling in the West, it's still usually a rule you have to buy a lot of it, you have to pay cash, but there's no impending crisis on the Western frontier. Land sales, revenue from imports will generate enough to pay the expenses of the United States. It is Jefferson and his Secretary of Treasury. His name's here on the notes. Name's Albert Gallatin is his name. And Gallatin believes that in the course of 12 or 16 years, the United States can actually pay off the national debt. That's a kind of radical idea, but Jefferson just doesn't want debt. Federalists, and this is where Jefferson will somewhat uphold the promise, Federalists will, of course, keep their job in office unless they are abusing their power. And so he replaces them. So this idea of turnover in office, not as much as probably he would like. And certainly what he's frustrated with, the new president Jefferson, is that after the election, now no one knew for a while if it was going to be Jefferson or Burr, and Burr, for the most part, after the whole shenanigans with the 1800 election, is pushed off to the sidelines. Jefferson doesn't talk to him. He doesn't consult with him about appointments that Jefferson can make in Burr's home state of New York. That stings Burr, but you have to think it's expected. I mean, the man did not step aside when it was clear that the Republicans favored Jefferson as president and Burr as vice president. Something that frustrated Jefferson when he comes into office is that John Adams had tried after the election. No one knew who the winner was going to be, Jefferson or Burr, but Adams thought, well, the Republicans are going to be the majority party. So what President Adams, outgoing President Adams, did is began to appoint Federalists, especially in the court system. And that is an ultimate source of frustration for the new president, Thomas Jefferson, because he can't remove some of these office holders, especially those who are in the different part of the judicial system. And one especially turns out to be a distant cousin of Thomas Jefferson. That's this man here. This is the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. This is John Marshall of Virginia. Marshall is going to be a fixture on the court for 30-odd years. So when the Federalist Party is essentially done for as a national force, it still exists in the court system, and especially on the Supreme Court. So it's going to be Marshall who casts this long shadow. Marshall is appointed to the court in 1801, and he makes one of the most important court cases in early 19th century, early American history. We'll talk a little bit about it. We've got several Supreme Court cases that you need to be familiar with. This is one of them. There's, I think, three that we're going to talk about in some detail. There's a lot of important Supreme Court cases, but this is one of the most important because it establishes the idea of judicial review. The Supreme Court case is called Marbury versus Madison, and it's made in 1803 in Jefferson's first term. Marshall, in this decision, the Marshall Court, because you name the court after the Chief Justice, so the Marshall Court decides to establish the idea of what we now are familiar with, judicial review, the ability of the Supreme Court to strike down part of or all of an act of Congress. In this case, it's the 1789 Judiciary Act. It expanded the power of the courts, and John Marshall ultimately decided that this law was unconstitutional. It violated parts of the actual 1787 Constitution. Not to get too bogged down in legal arguments here. So when you see Marbury versus Madison, you need to understand that it establishes the principle of judicial review. It's not used a lot by the court. It's not invoked, but it's there. Marbury versus Madison, 1803. Jefferson is a lawyer. He doesn't like the decision. He doesn't believe that the Supreme Court should try to establish itself on equal footing with the office of president and the legislative branch, but Marshall does. And there's nothing he can do about it. Short of Marshall completely abusing his power, he can't simply turn and say, I'm going to fire John Marshall. You can't do that. You can't do it then. You can't do it now. It's very difficult to remove a sitting justice on the Supreme Court. So Jefferson is going to have a mix of success and failure during his term in office. His biggest achievement of his presidency is the purchase of Louisiana in 1803. Now, let's take a look at a map here so we can kind of orient ourselves and really better understand how vast this territory is actually a part of the United States once it's acquired. We're talking about the Louisiana Territory. Now, if you look at this map, the United States extends to the Mississippi River. Now, that does not mean that we've created, at the time of Jefferson's presidency, all new states. Ohio becomes a state in 1803, Kentucky and Tennessee in the 1790s, but the other areas, west of Ohio, west of Georgia, are at this point organized territories. To the west of the Mississippi River, that area known as the Louisiana Territory. Now, when we consider Louisiana, we're not just talking about what we now know as the state of Louisiana. That became a state in 1812. We're looking at everything that you see here on the map. Across the Mississippi River, the dividing line, you would see it right there. The Mississippi Territory to the west, the Indiana Territory to the west. All of that belongs to Spain. And what happened in 1800 is that the French, under Napoleon, demanded that this territory be given back to France. And in a secret treaty, this exactly took place because the United States gets rumors of it from, of all people, the British. And the United States are somewhat caught off guard. What's happening in Louisiana? We approach the French and they say, we don't know anything about a treaty. Well, they made the treaty. And what the Spanish got a promise from the French. If the Spanish turned this territory over to France, they would not sell it to anybody else. And if you think Napoleon's going to keep these agreements, you're crazy. And so in 1800, when he becomes president, that's actually when the treaty happens, the secret treaty giving this area here that you're looking at, the Louisiana Territory, from Spain to France. Jefferson thinks, for the most part, as long as it's controlled by the Spanish, it's fine. I'm opening up the wrong thing here. Here we go. Okay. As long as Spain is our neighbor to the west, not a problem. If the French, under Napoleon, an expansionist Napoleon, a Napoleon who's talking about, among other things, literally creating a new French empire in North America, that is very difficult to consider. So what Jefferson decides to do is try to make an offer to purchase the lower part of the Louisiana Territory, what we would recognize more as the state of Louisiana, and have access to the lower Mississippi River, so that Jefferson's farmers, the folks he idealizes as the critical element of the United States economy, to have his so-called empire of liberty, as Jefferson calls it, you need access to markets. If you don't have New Orleans, we saw what happened when the Spanish closed it in the 1780s. It was somewhat disastrous for the development of the West. So it's Jefferson who says, I'm going to send over a negotiating team that's going to go over and talk with the French and try to purchase for several $1 million access to New Orleans, maybe purchase a part of the territory itself. But it is Napoleon and Napoleon's representatives who essentially stop the negotiations and tell the United States, well, he's got other plans. If we can purchase, Jefferson says, the area of New Orleans and access West Florida, that panhandle area, all the way from Baton Rouge all the way towards Pensacola, which includes now Alabama and Mississippi, that would be fantastic. Napoleon said he's waiting for news, of course, for the army that he sent to the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, the French have a full-scale slave rebellion on their hands. And it's led by this gentleman, Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint's rebels, and this is a slave regime in the island that is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So it's a major island in the Caribbean, in the West Indies, that produce sugar. There is an overwhelming African American majority on this island known as Saint-Domingue. This is the French colony. And so what takes place is Napoleon wants to send an army to put down this rebellion. Free blacks and slaves on Saint-Domingue have decided that they would take the opportunity, inspired by the French Revolution, to have their own French Revolution. And they're trying to attempt to overthrow the minority French plantation owners. And it looks like they may have some success. So Napoleon decides, step one on the whole negotiations with Louisiana is to put down Toussaint's rebel army. Step two, once the army is defeated, is that we're going to take this army and move it towards New Orleans. People in the United States tell Jefferson, look, with France as our new neighbor, it's a game changer. And Jefferson says, no, I basically think the French army in Saint-Domingue is going to get annihilated. And so he continues to slash the size of the American army and our military budget. Even Hamilton at this point is going absolutely crazy. He's thinking, what is this guy doing? It's suicidal for us to cut down the military to this degree. Jefferson has this everlasting faith that the French army, 30,000 man army in Saint-Domingue, is going to meet its doom. And he's right. Toussaint may have been captured, may have died in a French prison, but the rebellion is successful. It becomes the first independent black republic in the Western Hemisphere. It's Haiti. To this day. This is the revolution, a violent revolution like the American Revolution. The difference is the population is overwhelmingly African and African American. So when this army is effectively, French army, destroyed, it becomes, for Napoleon, a game changer. He decides that he shouldn't, and his dreams of establishing a new empire in North America are essentially over. So Jefferson had told his negotiating team, you could probably spend $3, maybe upwards of $5 million for New Orleans and West Florida. Then Napoleon offers the whole thing. He essentially says, look, for $15 million, you can have everything. And the Americans don't wait, really, for any kind of authority from Jefferson. They say, we simply can't pass up on this deal, and they agree to it. So Louisiana will include all of the former Spanish lands, all the way to the Rocky Mountains and all the way up to British Canada. The borders, the formal boundaries of Louisiana, we're not sure about. We ask the French, does it include Spanish Tejas, Texas? To which the French say, you'll just have to figure that out. How far north is it? There's 4 or 5 different maps with Louisiana marked on it with different boundaries. So we have to spend the next 15 or so years working that out. Now, it doesn't mean that we alone are the sole power in North America, because there's still significant numbers of Native Americans. There's a lot of unknown about what's out west. And of course, the Spanish have a good portion of the continent at this point. That's why Jefferson decides even before we try to purchase part of it from the French, we're going to explore Louisiana. This is the beginning of the idea of what will be known as the Corps of Discovery, or the Lewis and Clark Expedition. This is at the very end of Jefferson's first term, going into his second term in office. Lewis and Clark are 2 officers in the United States Army. Lewis, the man on the left, had been Jefferson's private secretary in the White House. On the right, William Clark. Lewis and Clark know each other. They essentially become co-captains in this expedition. And Jefferson has Congress authorize some minuscule amount, I think it's under $4,000 in 1804 money, for these 2 with hand-selected members of the military. They take, I believe it's just under 40 individuals in the Army. So they say, pick and choose who you want to go with you. And they go out west. They go out west and they carry with them medals that they will present to Native Americans. That's one of their missions, the Lewis and Clark expedition. Look at the different plants, chart the rivers. Jefferson has books in his library at home that say there are active volcanoes west of St. Louis, that there are woolly mammoths on the Great Plains. So this is an incredible amount of unknown and uncertainty in the American West. So Lewis and Clark have to find the source of the Missouri River. Let's see if we have, we'll get to those guys in a minute. Nope. Let's see if we can go backwards here and look at an actual, there we go. Here's a map of Lewis and Clark that left in St. Louis in 1804. You can see it's the red line as they trace the Missouri River across the Great Plains all the way up to near British North America or Canada. So that's one of their charges, or really we might say their mission. Go out, explore, draw maps, calculate distances, introduce yourself to the Native American nations there. If you can get any samples of plants and animals, and this is where those other slides that I kind of skipped through are interesting. Lewis and Clark come across on the plains the prairie dog, and they have to capture one. So they end up capturing one. They have these little, of course, dugouts that pop up from the earth, and they're like, this is amazing, we've got to catch this little critter. And they do, and they send a live one back to President Jefferson back in the East Coast. They also come across an animal that some of the French trappers and traders and Indians had been describing. That's the American grizzly bear. And Lewis and Clark were saying, no, we've seen bears, we've seen the black bear in Virginia, not a big deal. And everyone's like, nope, this is a big bear, aggressive bear. And later Lewis and Clark will write in their journal, and it's one of the most fascinating reads. This is all true. This is the greatest adventure story maybe in American history. They come across the grizzly bear. They try to shoot it because they want to measure the bear. They want to understand a little bit more about this beast. And they shoot it 4, 5, 6 times, and they can't slow this thing down. So eventually they just make a statement somewhere in their journal saying, you know what? We killed one, we looked at it, we measured it, and every run-in we have with it, we were scared. So we've explored all of our curiosity with the great grizzly bear, or western bear as they called it. And the Lewis and Clark expedition turned out to be pretty much a success. Even though they didn't find what their overall point of curiosity was. And that was trying to figure out if there was, in fact, an all-water route across the United States. The so-called Northwest Passage. That's the thing that had motivated explorers going back to Columbus and everyone else who's on a river. The Potomac River. Oh, is that the one that's going to carry us all the way to the Pacific? No. The Hudson River. No. The James River. The Jamestown settlers in 1607. No. The Great Lakes, no. So there is no all-water route across North America. It's a dream that dies, really, with Lewis and Clark. And you can see they had to winter in very cold conditions just short of the Rockies. They had to make this very difficult trip through, of course, the Rocky Mountains, where they got the help of a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea. And they eventually made it back. And much like Jefferson, who thought, no, Toussaint's army is going to destroy the French army sent to Saint-Domingue, a lot of people are telling him Lewis and Clark and everybody, they're gone, they're done. They've been ambushed by the Spanish, which almost happened. They've been wiped out by a Native American force, which they had tensions and fired at a Native American group, but they never had a serious confrontation with them. And Jefferson thought, nah, it's going to be okay. And it was. One soldier on the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery, as it was officially called, died of a burst appendix. And they don't know what to do with someone with appendicitis in 1804 or 1805. And so they buried him along the edge of a river there. And that was their only casualty. So it begins to understand, with this map, you can see a few things. Again, you can see the territory that outright is part of the United States in 1783 in green. You can see the blue, which counts as the Louisiana Purchase, which, as we see, it's unclear about where it actually ends. Jefferson would love to have included And you can see at the bottom there, Spanish Florida. Jefferson thinks a few things, that maybe the Louisiana Territory extends all the way past Nacogdoches, San Antonio, down to the Rio Grande. And the Spanish say, no, 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 I don't think so. We don't have any maps that say that. He also wants it to include the area, what's known as West Florida. You can see New Orleans on the map, and that orange area, the panhandle of what's now Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida itself. And the Spanish say no. So the Spanish, you can see, still hold on to Florida. They still have a smaller remainder of the old territory going back to the Spanish glory days of the 1500s. And of course, to our north, the British remain in Canada. The Oregon country, the Pacific Northwest, where Lewis and Clark ended up going. And they saw through the Columbia River the Pacific. And they were ecstatic when they saw it. That's a disputed territory. That's in the top left. That's the brown color. That represents area that the United States would like to have, the British would like to have, the Spanish would like to have, and even the Russians will later lay claim to it. So this is the continent as it looks during Jefferson's time. So it becomes, again, a challenge for presidents who follow Jefferson to try to work out the borders, not only with the British to the north, but to the Spanish in the west. But Jefferson's going to have other concerns during his time in office. So let's go back to the notes. Obviously, Jefferson in 1804 would like to consolidate his victory in 1800. You know, he had won, it had been close, he had to work that thing out with Aaron Burr, and now in 1804, he has a great plan, right? There's no impending war with anyone. He repeals all internal taxes, the Louisiana Purchase, and he defeats the Federalists. I, truth be told, can't tell you even the name of the Federalist who runs against him. It's an overwhelming victory. But like Washington, Jefferson finds that his second term in office is very difficult. In 1804, and this is kind of to put a final discussion on Aaron Burr, it's pretty clear that Aaron Burr is not going to be part of Jefferson's second term in office, and he's told that. He was, as the expression goes, persona non grata, someone you don't want to have around anymore. And so it is Burr who thinks, all right, to kind of chart my own political course, I'm going to need to run for office on my own. So he attempts to run as governor of his home state of New York, and he loses the contest badly. And it is Burr who decides the person who's most responsible for my loss of the New York governor race is Alexander Hamilton. And so he asked Hamilton, look, I know you wrote things about me. What did you write about me? What's your opinion of me? And basically Hamilton says, oh, it's all there in the newspapers. I don't have to explain myself anymore. And Burr says, no, that's not sufficient. And so he challenges Alexander Hamilton. Now, Hamilton had been out of political office since the end of Washington's term, practicing law, still operating as one of the leaders of the Federalist Party, even though the Federalists will never capture the White House ever again, or the president's house, or the executive branch. And so it's Hamilton who believes that he's satisfied all the demands by Aaron Burr. And Burr says no. And back then, what you can do if your honor was not satisfied, you can challenge that person who offended you to a duel. And that's exactly what happens in 1804. So this is a really interesting, obviously, set of circumstances when we think about it. We have the sitting vice president of the United States, that's Aaron Burr, challenging Alexander Hamilton, considered to be one of the founders of the Federalist Party. Now, this is, again, a painting version of what would have taken place. You see two gentlemen in the background. You go to the dueling ground. You have witnesses there. You have your friend. They pick the guns that would happen there, and Hamilton picked the dueling pistols. And Burr shoots Hamilton. Now, Hamilton, it's unclear to this day. People still argue, was Burr going to shoot Hamilton outright? Was Hamilton going to shoot Burr outright? He later tells some people that, no, I was going to just fire my pistol into the ground or at a tree or a passing squirrel or whatever. He doesn't. We do know that the bullet lodges in Hamilton's spine and he dies pretty much in extreme pain because they can't, surgeons back then only made things worse. They start poking around saying, oh, where's that musket ball in your body? And you're sitting there writhing in pain. It probably paralyzed him as well. And Hamilton died. This is all while Burr is still vice president. So he finishes his term in office. And then he goes over the next couple of years, leading this strange kind of conspiracy where he talks to folks out west, does Burr, about maybe taking part of the American West, Texas, Mexico, and leading a revolution and adding it to the United States. Or maybe because authority is weak in Louisiana, he's going to make himself some kind of strange emperor in the West. It's called the Burr Conspiracy. And to this day, we're not exactly sure what he had in mind, because he would tell Burr would tell 10 different people 10 different things. Until Jefferson said, no, we got to get this guy really back to Washington, D.C. They finally arrest Aaron Burr and try him for treason, which he's found not guilty, and Jefferson, of course, fumes about that. But it just puts a kind of an end to the story of not only Hamilton, who was buried in July of 1804, but Aaron Burr. He operates even in areas near Natchitoches, Louisiana, and near the Texas border as well, which is an international border at this point, because when you cross the Sabine River, again, it's a pretty easy drive from Natchitoches, but back then, when you crossed the river, you were in Spanish territory, as opposed to just being in the Louisiana, or specifically, we called it the Orleans territory. So the Burr Conspiracy is just one of those fascinating stories in our past. And it shows that the attention to the West had to be something that Jefferson kept in mind. Also, Jefferson had to keep in mind that the on-again, off-again war between France under Napoleon and Great Britain was going to affect the United States. After the Louisiana Purchase, and now because the French get $15 million of American money, it fuels Napoleon's war aims in Europe. They go to war again to England and France after 1803. The United States is caught right in the middle. The French and the English intercept American ships on the high seas. Jefferson thinks, oh, what are we going to do? I'm in the same situation that Washington was during his time in office. Well, we had, of course, the implementation of the Jay Treaty. We have the treaty with the French. But it doesn't matter. This is a fight now to the death. It's a fight to the death because Napoleon is very strong on land, and the British are very strong on the sea. The British Navy is keeping Napoleon from literally invading England. So what do you do if you're Thomas Jefferson? Jefferson had been very critical of Washington's policy as Secretary of State. You know, we have to side with the French. We're duty-bound to side with the French. And then Jefferson himself almost finds that he, like John Adams, might have to be forced into a conflict that he doesn't want to engage in, a conflict with, in this case, Great Britain. During his time in office in 1807, there's an incident which very much nearly propels the United States to war with England in 1807. This is a painting of what takes place. It's called, and the notes spell it out there for you, the Chesapeake Incident. An American warship is on patrol off the coast of Virginia. I mean, land is in sight. The ship is that close to the coastline of Virginia. And a British ship pulls up alongside it and says, look, American ship, prepare to be boarded. We're going to inspect your crew for runaway British sailors. And the American captain says, over my dead body. And the British ship fires on the Chesapeake. Several Americans are killed and wounded. It's a humiliating. I mean, this is a warship. The British have been practicing something that bothered a lot of Americans. The British and the French were both stopping American ships. Remember, if you can knock out American trade, if you are England or France and you can knock out American trade, you will be able to hopefully turn the balance of power in favor of England or France. And so when these Americans are killed in 1807 on the Chesapeake, the nation demanded that Jefferson go to war. The other part of the story that we have to understand and appreciate is the British were stopping American ships and they were looking for their sailors, not just American naval ships. We don't have a large navy, but our merchant marine. These are the unarmed ships that are going back and forth to the Caribbean, to different parts of the world, and to Europe. The British were stopping American ships and they were lining up their crew and they were grabbing people off it and saying, look, I believe you're a British citizen, so are you, so are you. And they were doing this because they have to keep their navy. The British Navy has to be the force that protects the English islands from Napoleon and an impending French invasion. So you can understand their point of view. To the Americans, this is an insult. We are an independent, sovereign nation, and you can't do this. But the British do it anyway. It's a practice called impressment. Not impress. Like I don't want to impress. It's spelled the same way as I want to impress you. But it's the idea that you press people into service. And in this case, by the end of Jefferson's time in office, several thousand legitimate American citizens were serving in the British Navy. And this was intolerable. So what are you going to do if you're Jefferson? What can you do? Well, it's Jefferson who thinks we can invoke a principle. Jefferson's a pacifist at heart. We'll call it peaceable or peaceful coercion. It's there in the notes. What we're going to do in 1807 at the end of my second term in office is I'll ask Congress for an embargo, which basically stops exports. So he's thinking the American economy is strong enough that it will change the policy of the French or the English. And he's wrong. The embargo is followed, but it's not very popular. You can imagine that if all of a sudden you stop exports of American products, you also stop imports. And let me explain how that works. If there's a sailing ship that's going to go to the United States full of cargo and it gets to the United States, and when it gets there, it unloads its cargo, but under the Embargo Act, you can't refill your cargo because exports have stopped. That means your ship doesn't go to the United States. So exports are stopped, but imports almost come to a standstill. The embargo is very unpopular, especially in places like New England. Let me show you this slide because it's actually from the time period. What they did in New England, you have to keep in mind, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts. This is the area where it's still a stronghold of the Federalist Party. Even though the Federalists are not a majority in the United States House or the United States Senate, will never win the presidency again. Their source of strength continues to be in New England, which had relied on the maritime trade. So you can see this cartoon here, the guy saying, damn it, and kind of bleeped out there, how he nicks them. He's referring to the turtle. That's the annoying embargo. And what you see the man carrying is a cask of sugar, or molasses more likely. And this guy says, oh, this cursed, oh, grab me. Now, if you look carefully at oh, grab me, it's embargo spelled backwards. E-M-B-A-R-G-O, embargo. And that's what they nicknamed the actual embargo. Oh, grab me. It's a reference to the fact that Thomas Jefferson and the Federalists, this wasn't lost on Jefferson. The Federalists are saying, oh, Thomas Jefferson, the man who very much wanted limited power from the Congress and from the president, is passing this legislation. Congress signs off on it. President, of course, puts it into law. That's going to kill our economy. And the embargo doesn't work. Now, Jefferson is still popular at the end of his presidency. Folks in the South and West, they abide by the embargo. They say it's the patriotic thing to do, and they actually think it's going to work. Jefferson's hand-chosen successor, he retires from the presidency. For a long time, presidents follow. If they wanted to serve 2 terms, they serve 2 terms. And what they did after his retirement is that he hoped that the man who helped create the Republican Party with him, James Madison, would be able to continue the Republican success in the office of president. Here's James Madison. No one's going to confuse him with George Washington. Again, he's 5'2" or 3, 100 pounds wet. Guy always wears gray and black, very serious, scholarly. Not the quintessential man on horseback like Washington or other presidents, but again, had put together Jefferson's idea of that Republican Party and had served, did Madison, as a position of Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State job becomes kind of a springboard to the presidency in the early 1800s. So it's clear that when Madison takes office, the embargo, oh grab me, whatever you call it, hadn't been working. So Madison comes into office with a host of challenges. I mean, his party is beginning to become divided about whether or not the embargo had worked. And so on his last day of office, Jefferson says, you know what, the embargo isn't working. We're going to repeal it, and we're going to put it in place, something to replace it. We'll call it the Non-Intercourse Act. And it's not as naughty as it sounds, because it literally refers to the fact that we're going to stop trade with both France and England. And whichever country, either the French or the English, lift their trade restrictions and the seizing of American cargoes, whichever nation behaves better, we'll change our policy towards that one. But it doesn't work. For the early years of his presidency, Madison keeps trying to change, augment, edit, we might think of, or even tweak a version of the embargo which is going to bring about a change from Great Britain or England or France. Great Britain and England or France. And it doesn't work. Now, Madison also, midway through his first term in office, has something else to deal with. In 1810, we see an election. 1810 is one of those, if you follow politics and all, and even if you don't, you may have heard the expression of a midterm election. The last one we had, obviously, was in 2018. It's a midterm election. And you can somehow see how the political winds might be changing when you follow a midterm election. So what happens in 1810? Well, we have new individuals voted into office for the first time. Members of the House and Senate. And I want to highlight a couple of them here in the notes, and also to talk about them in some detail. Here are a couple of them. This is the new class of senators and congressmen after 1810. The gentleman on the left is John Calhoun of South Carolina, slave owner, a nationalist, meaning he's very much fearful of how the United States is being treated by both the French and the English. On the right, we have Henry Clay of Kentucky. He's a Westerner. Again, Kentucky's a fairly new state. So they first get elected around 1810, and they get the nickname because they are part of Madison's Republican Party, but they are very hawkish on going to war with Great Britain. And so they're nicknamed the War Hawks. So this is the new representatives of the United States Congress. You have a big turnover in 1810. So they're putting pressure on Madison, not only for this slight on the high seas, the policy of impressment, but also what's happening in the West. And I think Henry Clay, the gentleman on the right, was very much mindful of what's happening in the American West. They also are concerned that in the American West, folks like Clay and others, that the British are purposefully inciting Native Americans to make war against the United States. Many of the war hawks are concerned about what they're seeing. We would call it a pan-Indian movement in the Northwest Territories, and it's led by a couple of individuals you should be familiar with. Now let's consider the map one more time. So we'll pull up the PowerPoint, and just to give you a reminder of what we're talking about. The British are operating obviously out of Canada, British North America. And the area that we're talking about is the Northwest, the border of Ohio, the Indiana Territory, and Michigan. You can see it right there in the middle of the map. So what they're concerned about, these so-called war hawks, is that they see the beginning of a pan-Indian movement, meaning Indians from different nations in the Northwest, the Shawnee, the Miami, the Ohio, the Wyandot, different Indians in the Northwest, are now organizing over a couple of very charismatic leaders. We've seen this happen in the past in our history. We saw it happen in King Philip's War. We saw it happen with the Pontiac Rebellion in 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War. Well, the spiritual leader of this movement, who promises that it is peaceful, it's a way to stop surrendering land to Americans in the West. His name is Tenskwatawa, but he's known by Americans as the Prophet. And it's the Prophet who says, look, when we all negotiate separately with the United States, we all lose land. And so we are going to negotiate together and not hand over more of our territory, our ancestral land. We got hooked on American products, European products, alcohol. So he represents this kind of revivalist idea among Indians in the Northwest. The military side of it, even though it's just to remain steadfast and not outwardly attack the United States, the military aspect is led by this man. He's a Shawnee Indian. He is the brother of Tenskwatawa, or the Prophet. He is called Tecumseh. So there's this perception by Americans in the West, American leaders, that the British are pulling the strings with this Indian movement in the Northwest. And you can see the area that we're talking about. The area on the map, let me just point out a couple features of it, where you see United States, that's northeastern Ohio. You can also see the significant number of American Indian villages represented by the different triangles. Now, the United States in the 1790s won in battle territory that became the state of Ohio, but there was land reserved for Native Americans. This was the Indiana and the Illinois territory. You can see it both there south of the Great Lakes. So what takes place and what is the center of the Indian pan-Indian movement is on the left side of the map. You can see it right there. It's marked as Prophetstown. Again, named after Tenskwatawa, the Prophet. The other gentleman who's watching with very keen interest in what's happening in the Indian Northwest is this man. This is William Henry Harrison. He's the territorial governor in the Northwest of the Indiana and Illinois territory. Again, these territories had not yet become states. And so it is Harrison who meets with Tecumseh. Tecumseh says, look, we're not going to surrender more land. We want this is not something that people should be very worried about, this pan-Indian movement. Harrison is a little bit shaky on believing him, as are many other Americans who live in the West. So back to what's happening with the big picture. Obviously, you have the British policy of impressment. Then you have the British manipulating Native Americans in the Northwest. That's not really the case, but that's the perception, and perception, as we know, often becomes the reality. Well, what Tecumseh would often do is he would leave Prophetstown on the map that I showed you, and he would travel to try to expand this pan-Indian confederation to areas in the Southwest. He would visit the Creek Indians, who live in what's now western Georgia and Alabama. He would try to bring them in to this idea of not turning over more land, of foregoing white clothing and their guns and alcohol. Again, that's why it has this kind of almost religious revivalist idea to it. Sometime in 1811, he went on another mission to travel to the South. And at that time, William Henry Harrison had a pretty significant force of American volunteers, portions of the United States Army, who were camped near Prophetstown. You see it right here on the notes again. And you can see it represented in the bottom left corner of the map. Harrison would have left Fort Vincennes, traveled to the north, and camped near Prophetstown. Now, before he left to go south, Tecumseh told his brother Tenskwatawa, under no circumstances are you to start anything, provoke something from Harrison. And this is now the end of 1811. This is, in fact, November of 1811. And that's exactly what happened. Tenskwatawa, the prophet, and his allies attacked Harrison's force near the Tippecanoe River. You can see it right there under Lake Michigan, marked in the blue on the map. The Battle of Tippecanoe, November of 1811. This is a war within what will soon be a larger conflict between the United States and Great Britain. Madison continued to experiment with ways by which he could change the British policies of impressment, seizing American cargoes. The French at least stopped American cargoes in a French port. The British were doing it out in the high seas. Madison is now bowing to pressure by war hawks of his own party. For national honor, we have to go to war against Great Britain. Unfortunately, the Congress doesn't help him out. Madison calls for military preparations. Let's increase the size of the army to 10,000 soldiers. Let us take the United States Navy, the mothballed fleet, out and make sure that it is prepared. The Americans have a dozen ships, the British 200, so it's a little lopsided. But at least it can present the idea to the British that we're serious. Let's call up and vote for new taxes. And Congress rejects all of these ideas. At the end of 1811, facing what looks to be an increasing situation which might lead to war, the United States does everything it can to not prepare for war. They don't vote the higher taxes. They don't increase the Navy. They don't increase the Army. And when he gets a promise from the British, President Madison, in the summer of 1812, that they will not change their policy at all, they will continue impressment, Madison's convinced that the United States has no other choice. And on June 1st, he asks Congress for a declaration of war. It is a divided vote on the war. The war is very unpopular, especially in the Northeast, but nearly all of the representatives and senators in New England vote against it because they know it's going to be devastating for the trade economy, the shipping economy of New England. So it, to this day, is still the closest vote to go to war in our history. It barely passes the Senate. So in June of 1812, the United States goes to war against Great Britain. Great Britain, who had been fighting France for over a dozen years. And prior to that declaration of war, we do literally nothing in preparation to take on Great Britain. Yet there is a sense of optimism. There is a sense that it will be easy. Even Jefferson, retired President Jefferson, says it's just going to be a question of moving soldiers from the American territories in Michigan and in Indiana into Canada. We'll be able to capture that territory, and we'll be able to get promises from Great Britain. The beginning of the war, both parties involved, the United States and Great Britain, look for ways to make it end. Because right after Madison's declaration of war in June of 1812, the British announced, we'll change our policies towards the United States, but by that point, we had already declared war. The War of 1812 is one of the most misunderstood conflicts in American history, but it's important for us to know what happens. We need to know that it's a war within a war. It's part of the Napoleonic Wars, when you think about it, Great Britain against France. And it's a war that the English didn't welcome, but it's a war the United States thinks we can win easily, even though we hadn't done anything to prepare for it. And that's what we'll talk about next time.